So this is joint work with Grégory Pontière, who has now moved to Louvain-la-Neuve, joining the chair Hoover. This is about a topic that we've been working on in various ways, and I think I need for this group to give you some background so that we are all on the same page, and you see where we are coming from and why we have the little contribution that we make in this paper, which is really following on discussions which have been taking place with various people in the field. So the main issue here is about measuring well-being when you have the various dimensions of life being summarized into two main headings. One is consumption, and the other is longevity. Right. There is also health and quality of life through health as a variant of that, but we'll focus in this paper on longevity. So I will talk about longevity, but a lot of what I'm going to say also comes from a literature that talks about health and not just longevity. And so if you, I hope you like figures, because all my slides are essentially around figures. And therefore, think of life as being represented in this kind of graph with two dimensions. And people have preferences over these two dimensions, and these indifference curves have the kind of ordinary shape. What is not obvious, of course, is when you think of longevity, that means we live many periods, and therefore consumption can change over life. And so to simplify the analysis, think of consumption as just one number, which represents something like a relevant index of lifetime consumption. So for the few economists in the audience, think of something like the permanent level. So something that would be a constant level of consumption throughout your life that would give you something equivalent to whatever you have as a life cycle, as a life profile of consumption over your life, something like that. So if you can accept that we take consumption as just one number, summarizing this material dimension of life over the whole life, then we can start. Okay. So we have these two dimensions, and the particular measure that we are interested in is something that comes from a somewhat long tradition, and I've been interested in it for more than 20 years now. And this is about taking well-being as something that can be measured through a number that is put on every indifference curve in this kind of graph. And the number will be measured in terms of units of consumption. Okay, so we'll measure well-being as consumption, but not any kind of consumption. It will be the consumption that, if it were associated with maximum longevity, would give you the same satisfaction over your whole life situation as your current situation. Okay, so if you can see my mouse here, so this is an indifference curve for this person. Imagine that this person is anywhere on this indifference curve with a particular level of longevity and consumption. And the equivalent consumption then will be identified by looking at the level that corresponds to the position of this indifference curve with maximum longevity. Okay, and that gives you the equivalent consumption. So that's a way of measuring well-being. And you can easily see that if you move to a higher indifference curve, that will raise your equivalent consumption. And so equivalent consumption is a representation of your preferences. Right? If it goes higher, it means you are on a higher satisfaction level according to your own preferences. Okay? So in the literature, actually, we used to talk about equivalent income, and that connects to money-metric utility, which is a concept that was introduced by Samuelson in particular. And here I will just talk about consumption, but it's very closely connected to this tradition of equivalent income. Okay, and as I suggested, feel free to interrupt me along the way if you have any question or if anything is not clear, especially during this background introduction. So one feature of this approach is that it involves willingness to pay. And it involves willingness to pay in the following way. So if the individual happens to be at this point here, so this dot here represents the situation of the individual, the equivalent in consumption will be the current consumption minus a gap, right? So the gap, the difference in level between this point on the curve and that point on the curve. And this can be interpreted as the sacrifice on this on the consumption level that the individual would be willing to make according to his or her preferences to achieve maximum longevity. Okay, so that's the idea. So as soon as you talk about willingness to pay in a context involving health, you see rising eyebrows on people's faces. And so let me address right away this question, right? So summarize, equivalent consumption is essentially ordinary consumption minus a willingness to pay. So if you do that, people are always afraid that you will be automatically giving priority to the rich because they will have a greater willingness to pay. So the answer to that problem is goes in two steps. The first, yes, the rich are likely to have a greater willingness to pay. That's true. And the reason for that is that here you have typical indifference curves. They tend to be flatter at the bottom of the space because when people are deprived of consumption, they care more about it. And therefore, this leads to flatter indifference curves. Whereas when they get richer, it's quite natural that the curves will become steeper. And so this greater slope of the curves when you get richer leads to a greater willingness to pay. And here these two curves could belong to the same preference, right? So we can imagine two guys having the same preferences. One is richer than the other, and therefore has an indifference curve that is steeper, therefore a greater willingness to pay to achieve maximum longevity. Right? But so that's the first step of the answer. So yes, as soon as you talk about willingness to pay, you are likely to register greater willingness to pay in the richer part of the population. But that's not necessarily a problem, because what we are doing here is measuring well-being. We are not adding up willingness to pay of people as is done in some traditional cost-benefit analysis, where just compute total willingness to pay for a project and so on, right? So when you do that, indeed, you treat every dollar as a dollar, no matter who has or enjoys this dollar. Whereas here, what we do is measuring well-being, and you see equivalent consumption will be indeed higher for the rich person than for the poor person. So maybe the gap in equivalent consumption is slightly less than the gap in actual consumption because of this greater willingness to pay of the richer guy, right? So somehow we could say, oh, but it looks like we will underestimate the inequalities in consumption by doing that. But that's actually fine because you are still free to introduce priority for the worse off in your social evaluation. So at the stage of doing social aggregation, you can introduce priority for the worse off. And if you introduce enough priority for the worse off, you will actually give a lot of weight to the needs of the worse off people, so much so that it can happen that you actually give much more priority to the longevity of the poor people, even if their willingness to pay is lower for them. Okay? So I hope it makes sense. And if there is any question or comment, please tell me. Now, another question that comes more from the health economist is why focus on equivalent consumption? And there seems to be an asymmetry in the evaluation here. And monetary units are somehow convenient for economists, and they are familiar with them, but they are a bit scary for non-economists. And people are afraid that somehow we are surreptitiously commodifying everything when we measure well-being in terms of monetary units or material units. And so it's natural to ask the question, why not take the opposite, swapping the axis and focusing on something like equivalent longevity, right? And so you could take a reference level of consumption and look at the position of the indifference curve that meets that reference level of consumption, and that would determine equivalent longevity? Okay, so that's a natural question to ask. And there is a recent textbook prepared by Richard Cookson and co-authors who discusses these two possibilities in a nice way. Now, another question. So let me not try to answer this question now, because that will be the core of the topic of the paper in a way. And let me talk about another question that comes typically in this context, which is why should we take maximum longevity as a reference? Why not take another level? And so here you could imagine that you could take an alternative reference somewhere in the middle or at a low level or whatever. And if you did that, you could still do something that's meaningful. You would have an alternative equivalent consumption. And if you kept the same alternative reference for everybody, and if you kept it constant when people change their situations, that would still represent their preferences, and everything would be consistent with people's preferences. So why not do that, right? So why choose one particular level which is somehow potentially far from where many people are, right? So if we take maximum longevity, many people don't reach that. So it's always risky if you think of practical applications. It's always risky to take references to see in terms of situations which are a bit far from where people actually sit, because you have to estimate their preferences, and such estimates are less reliable if you look at situations very far from where they are, if only because people may not really know what they are talking about if you ask their opinion about what it would be like to have maximum longevity, for instance. Okay, so these are questions to bear in mind, and somehow you'll find answers, or we'll discuss answers through this presentation. Okay, so maybe that's the time where I should stop, or let me go one step further. So the key element that we will use to answer this kind of question is mobilizing our intuitions or some arguments to discuss comparisons between people who are at the same point materially, the same bundle, but have different preferences. Right. And this is the kind of situation that you have here. You have Anne and Barb, and they have the same bundle. Suppose they are here, right? But Anne has steeper indifference curves, meaning she cares more about longevity than Barb, right? And so in this kind of question, what should you say? Okay, that's the question. And so the key thing that we will have in this kind of discussion is the following thing. If you say that Anne is worse off, in that case, and the argument could be, well, they both have longevity, which is not the best, and Anne cares more about that. So somehow Anne is suffering more from this gap in longevity, from this deficit. And so it might make sense to consider that she's worse off, right? So if you want to keep this kind of judgment for any situation like that, where you have crossing indifference curves, that will actually force you to take either maximum longevity as the reference, if you focus on equivalent consumption, or minimum consumption as the reference if you seek a computation of equivalent longevity. So you see, right? So if I put my reference to the right of this bundle, I will declare Anne to be worse off. You see, that's because her indifference curve is lower on the right of the bundle. And if I look at a reference consumption, I have to put it below the bundle, because again, that's where Anne's indifference curve is lower than Barb's indifference curve. Now, you also see here immediately that with longevity, we have something that can work, which is that most indifference curves, they cut the vertical line corresponding to maximum longevity. Whereas for consumption, taking a reference consumption that is low is likely to be important to not work very well for people whose indifference curve don't cross that level, right? So here I've taken a level where Anne has an equivalent longevity, which is already the maximum, and for Barb, it is not even defined. And so it's a bit harder to think of applying minimum consumption unless perhaps you take a high level. But if you take a high level of preference consumption, then you will not have this judgment that Anne is worse off. You would say that Anne is actually better off. Right? So here we have a kind of argument that may lead us to think that it makes sense to take first maximum longevity as the reference, and second, to focus on equivalent consumption rather than equivalent longevity. Okay. So let me perhaps bring one more slide before stopping and asking if you have reactions. In the book I co-wrote with Didier Blanchet on well-being, on Beyond GDP, we propose another kind of argument, which is to say that when we are talking about quality of life, and Alex, I'll give you the floor right away. When we are talking about quality of life, it may make sense to imagine that this should be priceless and take as a reference situation, a situation in which people would be free to choose this quality of life freely at zero cost, and then look at what they would do in that situation and take that as a reference. And so that means in this particular example, if longevity could be obtained freely, imagine a sort of budget set, right, an opportunity set, in which this individual having this bundle and this indifference curve would obtain the same satisfaction when longevity can be freely chosen at no price. Right? So that would be the situation in which the set that is offered to this person is this blue set here. And you see, when you do that, you'll focus, when you compare sets across people or across situations, they are all the same except for the height of this set. And so again, you will end up focusing on something like equivalent consumption. Right? So that's something that is another argument in favor of something like equivalent consumption. So let me stop here and ask if yeah, I can answer some of the questions coming up already.
Okay, so Alex, you're first.
Thank you, Marc. This is just a question about how preference-based this measure is, right? Because the equivalent income approach has going for it that it respects individuals' preferences over these bundles. But at the same time, I think what you were just explaining shows that we need a separate third-party judgment, or so to speak, a moral judgment, which goes beyond their preferences, in order to make interpersonal comparisons. For example, you have to choose your reference levels and decide, for example, whether high longevity is a good reference level or low longevity, etc. So what do we learn from this? Is it that even when we make preference-based judgments, we always have to move beyond individuals' preferences when we make interpersonal comparisons?
I guess, yeah, that's inevitable. But there is something in between. So obviously, it makes sense to rely on people's preferences for intrapersonal evaluation, right? Changes in the situation of the same person. Then you may want to rely on their preferences, not necessarily, by the way, their immediate preferences. Maybe you want to check that they are not crazy and they pay sufficient attention to relevant considerations and all that, right? So let's talk about ideal preferences, make sure we are not troubled by behavioral problems. But indeed, if you want to compare across people, it's impossible to just rely on people's preferences, except, I would say, I think there is an argument that can be made for this kind of case. When you have indifference curves that don't cross, right, that's a situation in which it's very tempting to say that if you were to declare that the guy who has the higher indifference curve is actually worse off, that would directly violate the preferences of these people themselves, right? Because they may have the same preferences or they may have slightly different preferences, but at least one is on an indifference curve that is everywhere above the other. So that is very much like the situation when we do intrapersonal comparisons, and you have a guy comparing two situations for himself at two different scales, which wouldn't cross, right? And so I have the impression, and I've been pushing this idea, that it's possible to say that we should somehow extend the idea of respecting preferences from just intrapersonal situations to interpersonal comparisons when we have this sort of robustness in the situation, because in different scales don't cross. So somehow preferences can lead us a bit beyond intrapersonal comparisons. But when indifferent scales cross like that, then it's much harder to make a judgment on the basis of people's preferences themselves. They disagree, and so, I mean, they disagree. You might say, well, they have the same bundle, so in a way they could agree that they are in the same situation, but that's not true. Because they can agree that they have the same bundle, of course, but they may disagree about whether this bundle is a good fit for them or not, depending on their preferences. And this difference in fit is something that is hard to evaluate by their preferences themselves. And I think that's where we need to rely on ethical judgments indeed. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much.
All right, second question, Johanna.
Thanks. So you might have said this in just the 10 seconds that I cut out, but and it's motivated by similar considerations as Alex. But so how do you go about setting maximum longevity, and does it have to be the same for everyone?
Yeah, right. So maximum longevity came from this kind of argument here. I've lost my mouse. Here it is. From this kind of argument, where if we want for every, so in this particular example, right, so if we just focus on these two individuals at this bundle, if you take any level of longevity for reference that is on the right of this bundle, you will get the judgment that you want, if you like the judgment that Anne is worse of. Right? But if you want to universally and systematically declare that the person with a steeper indifference curve but imperfect longevity is worse off than the other one at the same bundle, then the only way to guarantee that you always hold that judgment is to go for maximum longevity. Now, if there are different maximum longevities for different people, then the situation is a bit more tricky. And that's where perhaps this kind of approach is more promising, right? So instead of fixing a particular level of reference longevity, you could just say, we'll take the situation, the reference situation is a situation where quality of life, as longevity here, is priceless, and we let people choose whatever they like. And so if someone has access to higher longevity, that might make a judgment that is sensible. But nevertheless, I must confess, I'm not quite sure about how best to address this situation, because if someone has access to greater longevity, that is likely to correspond to an advantage, right? So it's somehow a greater capacity or allow a need. And so we probably would want to treat that more like an additional dimension that corresponds to something similar to different abilities. And that's a slightly different theory. So let me not commit to any definite answer on how to address differences in longevity, because that might run into troubles if we don't treat that as different capacity. So I will not, in the paper, we assume that maximum longevity is the same for everybody.
But what it sounds like what it means is the longevity you could possibly buy, or that's sort of accessible to you with the means you have.
Yeah, exactly. And so having access to greater longevity is an advantage in itself. And so actually what I said, suggesting to take this approach, is not necessarily a good idea, because someone could be on a higher indifference scale, have access to higher longevity, and end up with a lower equivalent consumption. So that would be contrary to the intuition. So I'm not quite sure how to address this question, except by treating it as a sort of separate argument. But I have to think about it. I'm not quite sure. Actually, it's interesting because I've been thinking about that in the context of comparisons across species. So dogs live less long than human beings, for instance, and this kind of comparison needs to be made there as well. Yeah, so I'll try to think of it for human beings only, where the context is slightly different because there is more structure for human beings than across species. Yeah, sorry, I don't have a really good answer, but it's an interesting question.
Thanks.
There are no more questions, so I think we can press on.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat by Hilary and Jonathan Cave about the fact that people, and that's a good question, people may not have monotonic preferences with respect to longevity. So my example here has this feature, but you could imagine that beyond a certain point, people are bored with life. And actually, you do observe that, even though it's not clear if that doesn't correspond to the fact that quality of life is so depleted that life becomes too hard. And somehow it's connected to the topic of the paper. But yeah, so the approach here with these equivalent budgets with the priceless quality of life can handle preferences that would have curves that would go up beyond some point. And then you would define the equivalent consumption, not by taking the maximum longevity as reference, but by taking this flat budget. And therefore, the person would choose whatever optimal level of longevity the person wants to have within this budget. And that might not be the maximum. So that would be totally fine. Actually, that's exactly what we propose in the book with Blanchet for things like leisure and this sort of thing, where people may not have monotonic preferences.
If I may intervene on this specific point, instead of measuring just longevity, you could presumably measure quality-adjusted life years.
Yeah, so quality is something that we'll capture here through the level of consumption. But indeed, we could have another dimension, which would be quality of health itself.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. And that would be a third dimension in that case. Yeah. So somehow we'll approach this question through consumption. But indeed, it would be a fuller model would have 3 dimensions. Yeah. Okay. So let me move on, perhaps. And now we'll focus, so let me now talk about the paper itself, where we focus on life in poverty, where life may be so unpleasant that people may consider it to be a burden. And so the idea is people may have a threshold of consumption, such that when they are below it, life is so hard that they consider the situation to be really a pain, and living longer makes the thing even more painful. Okay, so that's the idea, and we wanted to consider this situation. So in the conclusion, I'll discuss whether this is something that is realistic or what it means in practice. So if you have doubts about that, maybe we can defer this discussion to the conclusion. So the way to model that in our simple model is to say there is a threshold of this consumption. And remember, it's a summary of your quality of consumption, so to speak, over your whole life. And so if you are above it, life is enjoyable. If you are below it, life is no longer enjoyable. Right? And that means that indifference curves for the people, preferences would be like that. And so preferences would be like that with a feature that moving up to a higher indifference curve is always good. Okay. And actually the flat curve that you have, flat line that you have at the level of the threshold corresponds to an indifference curve itself, meaning that if you are at the threshold, longevity is no longer a good thing nor a bad thing. Not just indifferent about longevity, because that's when life is just about to be worth living, but almost not worth living. Right? So something like that. But what it means in terms of desire for longevity, it means that you reverse things, right? So moving to a higher indifference curve, if you have a life worth living, means you'd like to have longer longevity. Whereas if you are below the threshold, moving to a higher indifference curve means that you would have less longevity. Okay, so that you have a reversal. You always want more consumption, but you may want to have less longevity when life is already a burden because of too low consumption. Okay. And now the motivation for this paper is a previous paper by Gregory and a few co-authors that he had that looked at the situation in terms of equivalent consumption, taking maximum longevity as the reference, and finding a paradox. And the paradox is the following. So imagine that you, again, have Anne and Barb, but Anne and Barb has different preferences. And one aspect of their different preferences is that they have a different threshold for a life worth living. So Anne is more difficult to satisfy in terms of consumption, to consider life to be worth living. And because of that, we may be at a situation here at this bundle that they may share, right? They may have the same bundle, but at this point, Anne is below the threshold and Barb is above her threshold. And that's a situation where if we rely on equivalent consumption as measured before, we will see that because Anne's indifference curves are increasing that part, and Barb's indifference curves are decreasing, Anne will be considered to be better off than Barb. And that's the paradox, right? Because Anne is has a life that's not worth living in her own eyes, contrary to Barb. So that's the motivation for this paper. And so in the remaining time, I will propose two solutions to it, which are very similar actually, but I'll start with one because there are some technicalities which prevent us from merging the two solutions. So let me start with presenting some conditions that we would like the solution to satisfy. So the first one is sovereignty in the sense of, so think a bit of the Pareto principle, but the Pareto principle is about social aggregation. Here we are only about measuring well-being, right? So the object we want to characterize is a measure of well-being that can serve for interpersonal comparisons, but it's still an individual measure. It's not a social welfare thing. And so sovereignty means that we will respect preferences. So if you look at the same person or people having the same preferences, you will just respect their preferences. And here we will include a respect for the threshold. Right? So moving, but essentially what it means is moving up, moving to a higher indifference curve is always a good thing for this measure of well-being. Now, the key axiom is conditional priority. So this axiom says the following. We will fix two reference longevity levels, and you'll see why we have two levels. When we look at two individuals who have identical bundles and also identical thresholds, but possibly different preferences, right? But at least they don't have a different threshold. The worse off is the one who cares more about longevity, provided that if they have a life worth living, and both will have the life worth living because they have the same threshold. Okay? So if they have lives worth living, it's when they have less than the reference longevity that the one who cares more about longevity will be considered the worse off. Okay? So concretely think of, suppose maximum longevity is 120 years and the reference longevity is 100 years. Right? And so if they are below 100 years, the kind of intuition I was mobilizing before in my introduction will kick in, and we'll say the one who cares more about longevity will be declared the worse off. Okay? But if they are above 100 years, then somehow they have enough, and we will consider that we can reverse the judgment, and the worse off could be the one who cares more about consumption than longevity. Now, if they have lives not worth living, another reference longevity will be used, and presumably a low reference longevity, something like 20 years, okay? And the one who will be considered worse off when he cares more about longevity is when they are above that reference longevity, right? So for them, longevity is a burden, and if they have a lot of it above L2, then it's the one who cares more about that who is considered to be the worst off. So let me illustrate that in the following graph, right? So we are cutting the space into 4 parts. So they have the same threshold, okay? And we'll have this reference level L1 for lives worth living, and L2 for lives not worth living. And so the argument I gave before with Anne and Barb will apply in this area for lives worth living below L1, but the reverse will be set for things above L1. And when we are below the threshold, then it's those who suffer from a lot of longevity when it is a burden, who will be considered worse off when they have a steeper indifference curve, and the opposite when we have when we are below the threshold. Okay, so that's the key condition that we'll be using, right? So in this graph, the worse off is the one with the thick continuous curve, and the other one is considered to be better off. Okay, now we have a third axiom, which is translation, because we have to deal with the fact that different people may have different thresholds. And here, the axiom is somehow a sort of neutrality axiom with respect to translation. So if you have someone with an indifference map and a bundle, and you take another one whose situation is just a pure translation along the consumption axis of everything, threshold, bundle, indifference map, then the well-being is the same. So this is the example we have in mind. So Anne and Barb here have exactly the same preferences, except for this translation. Everything is translated up when we move from Barb to Anne, including the bundle, right? And so the idea is Anne at this bundle is just as well off as Barb at this bundle, right? So apart from the translation, they are on the same indifference curve. Okay. Okay, and so the key result we have is the following. So if we have these 3 axioms, that implies that well-being will be measured as equivalent consumption minus the level of the threshold of that person, where equivalent consumption is measured following this path in dashed red lines here. Right. So you have these 2 vertical references. The horizontal reference here is somehow neutral because this is an indifference curve of the person. So well-being doesn't change here. Okay. So somehow the intersection of an indifference curve with this line is the whole portion of this line segment. And so well-being will be measured in the following way. If you have a life worth living, you take the equivalent consumption minus the threshold. So it is this gap here that measures well-being, and it will be positive if you are above the threshold. When you are below the threshold, you will look at the intersection with this lower reference, and it is this gap which will be measured in negative terms. So we'll have a negative well-being measured in this way. Okay, and so that's the way in which the paradox can be resolved, because you see that if you are above the threshold, you have positive well-being. If you are below, you have negative well-being. So it can never be the situation that we had before can never occur. Now, this is one possible solution, and you may find it a bit weird that compared to what I was saying before, we now have L1 and L2, and the judgment we made about people being above L1 or below L2 may sound a little weird. And so there is a variant that works in the following way, and it somehow gets closer to the story about priceless quality of life. And it says the following. So we have to strengthen the sovereignty axiom. So instead of just looking at situations where we have the same preferences, now we will extend that, and that connects to the discussion with Alex earlier. We will extend sovereignty to respecting nested indifference curves. So if someone is on a higher indifference curve than someone else, and these curves don't cross, then we'll declare the one on the higher indifference curve to be better off, even if they have different preferences. Okay, so being on a higher indifference curve is a good thing. So somehow it's an extension of sovereignty to interpersonal comparisons with non-crossing indifference curve. And we will change conditional priority in a way that is somehow much simpler. So when we look at 2 individuals, again, with the same bundle, the same threshold, the worse off is always the one who cares more about longevity. Right? Somehow to take account of the fact that longevity is never enough when you have a life worth living, and is always too much when you have a life that's not worth living. Right? That would be the intuition. So L1, it's as if we were pushing L1 and L2 to the extreme of the space, right? So it's essentially saying L1 should be the maximum longevity and L2 should be the minimum longevity. But the previous theorem doesn't work if L1 and L2 are at the extreme part of the space. So that's why we have to strengthen sovereignty. So that's a technical detail in a way, it's not so important. What's more interesting is that somehow the reasoning, apart from this technicality, extends to the case in which you want to put the references at the extremes. And then you have this measurement, which is just the same thing as before, but with extreme references, right? Okay, and that's the same kind of theory. So I think it's time to conclude, and so just to summarize, what we have here is a proposal for refinement and extension of this notion of equivalent consumption. Maybe I should highlight the fact that these axioms have nothing really triggering an asymmetry between consumption and longevity. And somehow they, especially the last one, the conditional priority star, and somehow they trigger a measurement in terms of equivalent consumption. And so that's a result in itself, right? So we could not justify equivalent longevity with this kind of approach, and that somehow confirms what I was suggesting in the introduction. Now we could discuss the questions of the boundaries on both axes. So implicitly, I have assumed that we have longevity moving from 0 to 120 years and consumption moving from 0 to any level. But as I think someone mentioned that in the chat, there might be a minimum level of consumption for survival. And so this is something perhaps that should be scrutinized. It might be that we need to have a permanent level of consumption that is above a certain level. So maybe the part of the space that's relevant is only above this level, just for physical survival. Right? So you could have essentially two thresholds. One would be the physical threshold. If you don't have that, you don't survive. And the other would be the life worth living threshold, where if you don't have that, even if you survive, life is so painful that it's not worth living. And likewise, we could consider that the vertical axis, in terms of having very low longevity, it's not clear what happens there, right? So if you have extremely short life, you don't even make life plans and so on. And so it's not clear what happens to our analysis. And so maybe we need to also introduce a minimum longevity below which somehow things become blurry or very hard to evaluate. And so maybe our analysis applies only to people who have grown up enough so that we can talk about their lifetime well-being in a meaningful way, and also about their preferences over that. So I just wanted to flag these issues, and I don't have any wisdom about them. Now, let me address this question of the practical relevance of lives not worth living. So, so people are extremely resilient, right? So it's very rare that people say life is not worth living. Even though you do hear that, as I was suggesting, you do hear that, especially from very elderly people sometimes. But what happens is that you do nevertheless observe people having some kind of unhealthy or suicidal behavior in some situations which are very bad. So not necessarily being outright suicidal, but if you look at homeless people, for instance, they have a very short life expectancy. And somehow it is not clear if that could not be interpreted in terms of life not being worth living, and therefore you drift and you accept situations. You don't make the most you can to keep yourself alive. And even if you look at things like the opioid crisis in the US and so on, when life is hard and social bonding is disrupted and many things happen that make your life very hard, people tend to adopt unhealthy lifestyles which look a little bit like slow suicide. And so it might be that this threshold is something that we should be thinking more about. And that corresponds to not necessarily just consumption, but also the quality of social life and so on, below which people really tend to have behaviors that are either self-destructive or somehow implicit calls for help. So let me stop here, and I think we have reached about the time, right, for opening general discussion.